Kenya, Mr. Speaker, and they have found there are gaps and issues that have been wanting, Honorable Speaker. It's very regrettable, and I offer my deepest condolences, Mr. Speaker, to all the families who lost their children during this demonstration. It was uncalled for, Mr. Speaker, and maybe it could have been done in a much better way, because no life needed to be lost, Mr. Speaker. This nation has been in crisis in different times, but maybe the actors were different, Mr. Speaker, because one of the periods when this nation was in a crisis was when the new constitution, or the Constitution 2010, was being made, Mr. Speaker. And the way it was crafted by the drafters of that constitution, Mr. Speaker, I look at Article 10 of the Constitution and I ask myself, if only the public sector, the state officers, public officers, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary had bound themselves to the national values and principles of governance in Kenya, would we still have been where we were at last week on Tuesday, Mr. Speaker? And in this Article 10, Mr. Speaker, we see the values and the principles that have been enunciated, Mr. Speaker, under the Constitution. And these principles are supposed to apply and be interpreted in line with any person or any state organ, state officers, public officers who are entrusted with public responsibility of performing any public duty. And these principles are supposed to apply across board and to any person who is given an opportunity to implement any public policy decision. And in these national values and principles of governance, which include patriotism, national unity, sharing and devolution of power, the rule of law, democracy, and participation of the people, are some of the principles that are supposed to guide the governance and the implementation of any public policy, Mr. Speaker. A respect to human dignity, equity, social justice, inclusiveness, equality, human rights, non-discrimination, and protection of the marginalized, Mr. Speaker. And when I look at Article 10, 1C, Mr. Speaker, about good governance, integrity, transparency, and accountability, and having regard to sustainable development, if only we had paid more attention, Mr. Speaker, as public officers, as state officers, would we have been where we were last week on Tuesday, Mr. Speaker? I specifically look at the Senate, the role of Senate, as laid out, very well laid out in the Constitution, on issues of good governance, transparency, and accountability, and the fact that we have a function of oversight over the counties. Is there anything we could have done better than how we have done? Maybe yes, Mr. Speaker, maybe there are areas, and there are areas that we need to improve also as a House, Mr. Speaker. The storm we saw in this nation, sweeping this nation, Mr. Speaker, and Parliament being at the eye of this storm, it was also an indictment to the institution of Parliament. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, and to follow what the other speakers have said, because today is not a day of competing on who gives a better speech or who does better debating than the other, I want to apologize that if we have failed as senators, Mr. Speaker, we are sorry. I am sorry, Mr. Speaker. Are there any tools that would have enhanced transparency, that would have slowed down issues of corruption? Mr. Speaker, I have served in other respects, even as a Secretary General of the ruling party, former Secretary General of the ruling party, Mr. Speaker. And I know for a fact it is possible to run a system without collecting a bribe, from my own experience, Mr. Speaker. And I want, as we do this debate, Mr. Speaker, that first of all, it forms a platform for us to have an introspection as Senate, Mr. Speaker. That's our tool. When we do the CPIC and the CPAC committees, what do we do with the reports that emanate from counties where we can see that corruption is rampant, Mr. Speaker? It is my view That is a way of improving the system so that we can have the public inject their confidence once again in this institution, is that the reporting back of those notorious counties should come back to the floor of this House, Mr. Speaker, and action must be taken. Concerted, Mr. Speaker, collective action agreed upon all the senators that what needs to be done by EACC with counties that have had wanton corruption and misuse of public fund, Mr. Speaker, that concrete action must be taken. And Mr. Speaker, we have also had a chance as a House to look at some of the impeachment proceedings. It has also given us time to reflect, Mr. Speaker, on how we have conducted those proceedings and whether they have met the expectation, the legitimate expectation, Mr. Speaker, of the population, Mr. Speaker. To the Gen Z who have woken us up, Mr. Speaker, and who have called institutions to rethink how we are conducting our business, Mr. Speaker, I want to say, this being our children, they have done well and in a very bold way. Without any experience, without having any forms of arms, Mr. Speaker, they came out to resoundingly say something must change. And the finance bill was the trigger, Mr. Speaker. They were not comfortable with how that finance bill was phrased, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that they felt they were not listened to. Was this an expression of just the Gen Z? Maybe it was an expression of many more Kenyans who may not have had an opportunity to express themselves. Mr. Speaker, these young people came out as true patriots, tribeless, without any boundary, Mr. Speaker. They defeated the class division, and they came out, Mr. Speaker, to speak resoundingly. My only unfortunate moment, Mr. Speaker, was when the demonstration was infiltrated and turned violent, Mr. Speaker, and there was a standoff between the demonstrators and the law enforcement and security officers, Mr. Speaker. The conflict that ended up landing some of them into mortuaries, Mr. Speaker. And as Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, we need to have a retrospection of all the officers, the state officers who are seated in public offices. If there was something that was happening that was off and had a tendency to have a corrupt tag, this means the storm now must stop on corrupt practices, Mr. Speaker. Let everybody look through how they are conducting their affairs, beginning with us, Mr. Speaker, because today we are talking about ourselves, more of ourselves. How are we conducting our affairs? For those who are Christians like myself, the good book will guide us into what is godly order. For those who are Muslims, Mr. Speaker, while we are guided by the Bible, the Muslims will be guided by the Quran. But for the nation, Mr. Speaker, we have the Constitution that guides how governance must be done and how structures should be laid out, Mr. Speaker. Where we have gone wrong, Mr. Speaker, does that Constitution offer us an avenue of ventilation? Mine is to call upon the Gen Z. Now that we have begun to listen to what they have to say, mine is to call upon the Gen Z to allow us to walk the order of the Constitution, to accept that an olive branch now has been given by our President, Mr. Speaker, and that is the highest level of executive commitment, that the President is willing to have a forum with the young people, with the Gen Z, and discuss issues that need to be thrashed out, Mr. Speaker, must be taken as a sign of very, very goodwill, Mr. Speaker. And there are those issues that have been laid out. Is it possible for a nation to change within a day? Is it possible for a nation to change within a day? I see it has signaled an opportunity for us to begin the change. And while all the demands may not be met overnight within a week, within 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, yet some of those things that are glaring, Mr. Speaker, like dealing with the corrupt cases, dealing with issues that are obvious and that have evidence, Mr. Speaker, that ball should begin rolling, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because if we cannot face the change, then change will change us, Mr. Speaker. It is my view, Mr. Speaker, that if we can honestly face ourselves, the society to face itself, EACC to also come out of slumber, take up those files, prosecute those that need to be prosecuted where there is sufficient evidence, Mr. Speaker, that corruption has happened within institutions, Mr. Speaker, then even the Gen Z will begin to see that we are serious and committed to upholding the dignity of every Kenyan, Mr. Speaker. Regarding the jobs, it is true, Mr. Speaker, the youth have faced a lot of unemployment, and I can only imagine how distressing, Mr. Speaker, this is when a young person has gone through schooling and has nothing to do, Mr. Speaker, and yet we are supposed to give solutions as leaders, Mr. Speaker. Those are issues that now need to be tackled in a different way. Is there bias in the way public office employs young people? Mr. Speaker, we need to straighten out the processes. We need to do things, Mr. Speaker, in a different way. And I want to specifically look at the suggestion that has been done by SRC for the raising the salary, Mr. Speaker, of the senators and members of parliament, Mr. Speaker. That proposal, while it may have been good because everybody needs a raise at any point when they are working, a worker needs to be motivated. The